Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, from wherever you are. Oh, I see someone from Chicago. I don't live there anymore. That's my hometown. Shout out to Chicago. This is the year the Cubs are going to win the World Series. We did it once. Maybe we did it twice. I don't know. That's a topic for another day. We're here to talk about Parashat Tetzaveh. I want to place it in context in the book of Exodus and focus on a particular passage. Much of today's learning will be framed, and we'll get there eventually, by the teachings of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel from my favorite book of his, and I'll say more about that a little later. As the welcomes in the chat are slowing down, I'm gonna in a second I'm gonna put a copy of my slides so you could open it up. I'm going to give you the introduction first, because I know once I put that link there, some of you will rush to open the slides, and which is great. But a few words before you do that. One could summarize the book of Exodus as a book that has three main parts with three different themes. The first being redemption. That it's our purpose to free ourselves from serving whatever Pharaoh it is we serve, so that we could serve a higher purpose. Redemption is theme number one, and the beginning of the book is about that redemption. In the biblical narrative, it's redemption from Egypt, but it's a stand-in, I think, for redemption from whatever, as I said, Pharaoh that we serve. Theme number two, revelation. We can hear God's voice and get access to God's will, and part of our purpose in the world is to follow the divine command. That's central to the book of Exodus, right, leading to Mount Sinai, right, the giving of the 10 utterances, Sered HaDibrot at Mount Sinai. Second theme, revelation. The third theme is about constructing sacred spaces, which we are now knee-deep in the middle of. The book of Exodus gives long passages and many chapters and many weeks of Parashat Shavua that it dedicates to talking about the construction of the portable tabernacle that the Israelites used in the desert as a sacred space that they could take with them as they journeyed through the desert towards the land of Israel. And that third theme is about creating sacred spaces, and we're knee deep in the middle of that. And that's what we're going to look at, one passage from that today. Much of the Parshiot, not just this week's, the others that surround it as well, focus on it's the blueprints. It's the description of here's what you make, and here's how you make it, and here's what goes into it. There's a doubling in the Torah, because there's the instructions about here's how to build it, and then there's the description of, and now we're building it, which is almost in some places like a word for word repetition of, the building it maps exactly onto the description of how we're supposed to build it. But in the middle, or actually towards the end of this week's Parsha, we have a description of the purpose. What's the purpose of the tabernacle? What's it there for? And that's what we're going to look at today. So now I'm going to share I'm going to both share the link to the sources I'm about to share, and I'm going to share my screen so we could look at them. Here we go. And I'm going to start the slideshow. All right. It always amazes me how quickly people get into the document, and how many so fast. There you go. So these are Exodus 29, verses 43 to 46. Last time I was here, I talked about it's important sometimes to look at what translation you use, because each translation is its own commentary of the Torah. So I thought it was important to note, for those of you who were here, I don't know, about a month ago, that this translation I'm using today is the Koran translation. It appears on Sefaria if you're interested in looking at it more and comparing it with the others. But this one I found it highlighted the theme a little bit. So verses 43 to 46, I'm going to read them to you. Read along with me, and you hear the words. What I want you to focus on is in these verses that talk about the purpose of the sacred space, What does God do to make it sacred space? What do the people do to make it sacred space? And what's the purpose of the space in and of itself? Make sense? What's God's role? What's the people's role? And what's the purpose of this whole thing? Anyways, here are the verses, right? And there God is the I, there I will meet with the children of Israel, and it shall be sanctified. It is the tabernacle, shall be sanctified by my glory. And I will sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar. I will also I will also sanctify both Aaron and his sons to minister to me in the priest's office. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God that brought them out of the land of Mitzrayim, Egypt, that I may dwell amongst them. I am the Lord their God. So those are the verses that talk a little bit about what this whole endeavor is about. I want to go back to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and ask you to plunk into the text. Maybe people started to. What is it that is God in the building of the tabernacle and its purposes? What's God going to do to make this a sacred space? And what do the people do as a part of that based on that source we just saw? Throw some answers into the chat if you have something in mind. I'm pausing while people collect their thoughts. People need to meet with God. Where the people contribute, God resides there. God purifies it, makes it holy. Oh, now it's coming. There we go. The floodgates have opened. People had their thinking and typing time. So God wants a purposeful place where people can find God, and God dwells there. Right? God delivers the plans, people make the tabernacle. God will be with the people. It's a two-way contract, right? There's parts on both sides. Nice. You could keep throwing things into the chat as the ideas come to you. So, right, some of these comments reflect what we've seen before. God tells Moses to tell the Israelites to build this. The people make donations of property, right? There's a fundraising campaign. The people donate raw materials to make the tabernacle happen. God provides the blueprints. The people build it. Next week, we'll meet specifically some artisans that God appoints to direct the process. I'll save that for next week's. Oh, well, you have to read that one on your own because sorry. Sorry to call. We'll meet those artisans next week. The people build it. And then when the construction is finished, I'm going to go back and put the verses back up to highlight what's in them. Give me a second. There we go. Right. God meets with the children of Israel there. Right. So that's a number of you worked on that theme. This is meant to be a meeting place, meaning somehow Bnei Israel come to the tabernacle and God comes to the tabernacle and somehow there's some exchange there. We know the verse before, which I cut out, talks about this is the place where God and Moses have their conversations. So according to the biblical narrative, when God speaks to Moses and tells him X, Y, or Z to share with the rest of the Israelites, here's where it happens. But the place is not just for the intimate connection between Moses and Israel. It's also Moses and God. It's also a place where all of Israel meet with God. Notice the next verse. I, God, will sanctify the tent of meeting and the altar, right? And we had it in the previous verse, right? The act of actually making it holy according to these verses is what God does. God comes to the place and sanctifies it somehow. The elevation of this space to a holy space has to do with somehow God's actions, not the people. We see again a purpose. I will dwell among the children of Israel. God will. This is a place where God can be in the Israelites' presence, and as a result of that, somehow God becomes the God of the Israelites. What do the people have to do, or what's the result of this all? The last verse says, "They shall know I am the Lord their God that brought them out of Egypt," right, to dwell amongst them. The people, right, the people know, and I think the word here, it's not about knowledge, facts like what we learn in school. There's like a deep awareness. The people have this awareness and acceptance that God is their God, that God took them out of Egypt, right? God is the Redeemer. God's supposed to be in their presence, and that they have a relationship with this God who did all of these things. It's a powerful notion, these verses here, that the idea that the construction of sacred space is a joint venture between God and the people, that it's both, in part, becomes sacred space because of what God does and what the people do. It's a powerful, powerful idea. It's meant to serve us right into the future as we think about the creating of sacred space. And one of the things that sometimes, if you look at the biblical narrative as a whole, we know it doesn't always work. And I'll take that back to the three main ideas of the book of Exodus that I started with, right? The Israelite people experienced the power and magnitude and liberation of redemption. God, with miracles, takes them out of Egypt. And there's a way in which, in the narrative in the book of Exodus, it seems that God hopes that that might be enough, right? That the miracles of Egypt, right? I took you out of Egypt with a strong arm, and it seems that God hopes that the people will recognize God's strength, God's power, God as the liberator, and the relationship between God and the people of Israel will be solidified after leaving Egypt. But we know that was not enough, right? The children of Israel weren't fully aware. They didn't fully acknowledge. They didn't fully embrace the redemption. They start complaining pretty soon after that. The next theme of Exodus is, right, revelation. They're taken to the mountain. There's better than Spielberg firework, and Lucas, display of revelation, right? All the special effects you can imagine. The magnitude of revelation is bigger than that. God's voice resounds from the heaven a little bit. The Midrashim talk about what that might look like a little bit. And they receive the Ten Commandments. And what do we see? The impact of that event doesn't touch the people always, right? There's the golden calf. There's also more complaining. So redemption and revelation don't do it. And we know also after the building of the tabernacle, the creation of sacred space, we know as we move from, right, the book of Exodus ends with the dedication of the tabernacle. But as we move into the next books, we know also the people complain, there are rebellions and revolts, right? The creating of sacred space in their midst where God can live is also not always sufficient for the Israelites, who continue to struggle to see God's in their presence, to hear God's voice, and to know that God is the one who brought them out of Egypt and wants to dwell among them, and is their God, like these verses have to say. It's a challenge that the Torah brings, that right, it lays out for us all kinds of themes about how we're supposed to encounter God, and consistently shows that the Israelites struggle to meet God in those places where God hopes to meet them. So I wonder, thinking about that, what is the message of all of this? What are we supposed to do with this? How do we move forward there? And this is where I want to turn to a passage from Abraham Joshua Heschel that I think addresses this some. Before I flip the side to that page, I want to say, well, I usually right with gender neutralize the text. I left Heschel's words in its own in its original. I think if Heschel wrote today, he would use more collective and inclusive pronouns than he did. But I didn't. His words are such poetry. I didn't want to change them. But if you can, read them as more inclusive than they might be. So I want to look at those words, and then we're going to come back to talk about how they relate here. I got to move a Zoom toolbar up and over the words so I can see what's here. Sorry, Zoom's not. There we go. Heschel's in the so this comes from a book, God in Search of Man, a philosophy of the Jewish religion, philosophy of Judaism, I think. It doesn't address necessarily the passage we looked at specifically, but in general, I think there's a connection to it, and you'll see what I mean in a second. If you know Heschel, you might be familiar with this book. If you don't know Heschel, I think God in Search of Man is one of his, he's got many, but I think one of his most powerful readings. And I'm actually finding in this day in particular, returning to Heschel and God in Search of Man has been uplifting for me. You might want it. If you're feeling the need for some uplift, this might be a place to go. So here's what Heschel says. Lift up your eyes and see. How does a man lift up his eyes to see a little higher than himself? The grand premise of religion is that man is able to surpass himself. That man who is part of this world may enter into a relationship with him who is greater than the world, and that man may lift up his mind to be attached to the absolute. That man who is conditioned by a multiplicity of factors is capable of living with the demands that are unconditioned. How does one rise above the horizon of the mind? How does one free oneself from the perspective of ego, group, birth, and age? How does one find a way in this world that would lead to an awareness of him who is beyond this world? Let that sink in for a minute. Heschel's claim that he makes here in the middle paragraph is that the idea of religion is to try to get beyond ourselves. And in particular, that we can enter into a relationship with God. God is defined by the fact that God is beyond ourself, right? He says, right, we are conditioned. He means like limited here, right? There are ways in which we as human beings are limited by our strength, our ability, our minds, our lifespan. There are lots of limits. And somehow we can have a relationship with that which has no limits in the world. And he asked the question, how does a man lift up his eyes to see a little more, a little higher than himself? And as Heschel reads Torah, Heschel thinks that what the Torah is trying to do is to make a claim about how we might do that. That's what I think this passage from Shemot that I looked at, that I brought today, speaks about. More so than the details here about that we've been reading, right? The claim of this, the details about what went into building of the tabernacle and each and every peg and bead and board that the Torah describes. What's important about these parshiot they're reading, I think, is this passage that says the sacred space that we're constructing could be one of those places that Heschel's talking about, where we can see above, beyond ourselves, and notice God's immanent presence in the world. And the Torah has two claims that Heschel would point out to us about the tabernacle and based in this passage. So one is the possibility of reaching beyond ourselves to meet God and to know God. Maybe there are more than two. I said two. I have more than two. One is the possibility to reach beyond ourselves and meet God. The second is that one way to do that is through the construction of sacred space. That by creating sacred space, we can bring God's presence to dwell amongst us. And three, that like it says here, right? It's when God comes to sanctify the space. God comes to make it holy. God comes to dwell there. It's the bringing in of the presence of God to the space, and through God's presence that the space is transformed, not in the human construction itself. Heschel will note a lot that we in our own civilization can build great monuments and great edifices, both to celebrate our own advances, right? The tallest of skyscrapers are in part, buildings that proclaim, our ability to overcome the laws of gravity and build something that goes up into the heavens. Different story in Genesis talks about maybe the theological dangers of the spiritual dangers of that. But we could build magnificent temples, but if there's spaces that are there just for us to worship our own ability to create a beautiful space, we're going to fall short. That the idea is that we, when building and creating sacred spaces, have to make them places in which God can reside and use them to be aware of God's presence in the world, and not to dwell on the beauty that we've imbued into the space. That the idea is we help construct the space to invite God's presence in, and that's a place where we can know God. And the sacred space might help make that happen, but it's God and God's presence that really it puts it all together. Going back to the Heschel quote, and the last thing I want to say about this, and then I'll open it up to questions. I see that chat is exploding a little bit. Uh-oh. My mouse seems to, oh, there we go. Sorry. Last thing about Heschel from this. Heschel sees the Torah as a place that gives us the questions and not the answers. Meaning, it's not that we're supposed to take the description of the tabernacle and build it again today. It's maybe not even that we have to build something in that exact sense that fit, at the time and the people in the biblical narrative. Heschel would say the claim that the text makes is that we can have a relationship with God. We can find God in sacred spaces, both in nature and those that we construct. And what's important for us to take from the Torah, what's important for us to take from this passage in this week's Parsha, is not how the Israelites did it in the biblical narrative, but is to take the question that comes from the claim. If we can have a relationship with God and we can have a sacred space be a meeting point between us and God, goes to the questions that Heschel asks at the end. How do we rise above the horizon of our minds? How do we free ourselves from ego, group, earth, age? How do we find a way in this world to expand our awareness of God who's beyond this world? And how do we carve out space for that unconditioned presence to come into our midst so that we can connect to it the way that the Torah in this week's Parsha envisions that the Israelites tried to do in their day as well. So I'm going to stop the share there and pause with that point. I have to say, this is an echo. If you've been here before, you've heard me say this before, was not able to follow the 46 or so messages that came in while I was sharing those things, but I know the chat in and of itself is a great discussion of the ideas that are coming. If you have a comment or a question, you can put it in the chat, but if you want to raise your hand too and chime in, we can make that happen. So if you can use the digital hand raising function, there used to be a button, but more and more, I think if I do this, it just, I'll see if I wait long enough, my hand will go up. I saw the timer. All right, I see Benjamin. Can you unmute? There we go.
If the purpose of creating a sacred space is to meet the divinity, then why all the grandeur that goes into it rather than a shaker simplicity?
I love that question. I love that question. To stick with the theme, the Heschel theme, I think Abraham Joshua Heschel would challenge us to find God in the simple places as much as the magnificent places. right? A quiet moment, right, in nature could be both a combination of sacred time and sacred space where we can feel God's presence, as much as a magnificent edifice. I wonder sometimes if the Torah's perspective is on this, if the people didn't feel God's presence because of the way in which they were taken out of Egypt, if the people didn't feel God's presence after Mount Sinai, maybe this was another attempt to let's have something a little closer to home, but it should be, this effort that goes in might be a way to get people's attention. They contributed, they brought supplies, they helped build. Possibly that the creative process, the way in which everyone was involved in making this happen might lead to an edifice in which they could feel God's presence. But I think, Benjamin, like it's hinted at in your question, sometimes that doesn't work. We know the tabernacle is finished, and we go on to the next book where we see it doesn't become this rallying point for God in relationship like it ought to be. It's some of that struggle between how does man overcome himself, like Heschel would say, to be able to feel God's presence. So I think you're pointing to something very true. We can meet God in simple places. Sometimes we think making it fancier and grander helps bring in God's presence, and sometimes that does. I've been in some pretty impressive synagogues and cathedrals and mosques in which you can feel the spirituality of the place. And I've been in simple, basic places that work too. I think you're onto something. All right, Cheryl.
I unmuted
sorry.
Arnold, so we'll go to Arnold.
Okay, no problem. Arnold, then Cheryl. Thank you.
Mine is just a follow-up of what Elliot said, and you sort of were getting to it, but didn't the first and second temples sort of go against this idea? And when people would look on that, it's just like looking at a castle almost, and there was no, because you can't get in, it's just everything is on the outside. It feels like a separation from God as opposed to getting close to him.
There were some, what's different between the temple and the tabernacle is at least we have, right, some of the archaeological remains of that, so we can see and feel, right? The tabernacle, you could go online, I'm sure, and see recreations of what the tabernacle must have looked like, it must have felt like. But the change from a temporary structure that was portable to like the brick, well, it wasn't brick and mortar, it might have been stone and mortar, that was the temple. And some places just stone, they were big enough they didn't need mortar. There's a way that the temple might have built walls around God's presence and not give access to the people. I appreciate that, Arnold, as pushback as well. And we also know from the critique of the prophets, the way in which the temple as sacred space became a place of empty ritual. Right, the prophetic call against temple worship was not about some rejection of the sacrificial system because there was something wrong with it in and of itself, but because it had, right, the way in which the activity that happened in the temple became about power, became about money, became about just going through the motions, which without really thinking about what the purpose of these sacrifices for. Not only did the stone, edifice keep people out away from God's presence, but the actual activity that happened there might have shifted from the spirit to other places, and the temple became a pharaoh of its own, from which we needed redemption. That was a prophetic voice as well. So I agree with what you said, Arnold. Cheryl.
So what came to my mind was a song from many years ago. Every time I hear a newborn baby cry, or touch a leaf, or see the sky, etc., etc., there's everyday miracles in our lives that we just take for granted, that just pass us by, that if we pay attention to them, will show us how close to us God really is. You know, all these different things that are just incredible things. Like how is it that every leaf on this tree is the same but so different? You know?
Yeah.
How is it that
Um,
the sky looks blue? You know, there's just so many things that
Yeah.
are so incredible in this world.
Very powerful. I know Purim's coming. I'm already preparing for my Passover Seder. There's a passage in the Talmud about Passover that a rabbi asked their servant, their household worker, about why we're here for this meal, and he says, well, partly we're here for this meal to recognize that God took us out of Egypt, and we're now free to worship God. And the rabbi says to their servant, you've exempted us all from asking the 4 questions. I share that story. It's on my mind because Cheryl, you've exempted yourself from reading Heschel's God in Search of Man, and what you just said was a great articulation of the theology of Abraham Joshua Heschel that and echoes what Arnold said before. I can't remember if it's Arnold or Benjamin. I forget. Forgive me. One of you said before about it doesn't have to be a grand a grand edifice, or it doesn't have to be a moment of revelation. That we can find God in the simple places and at every single moment. Right? He might say, I wonder what he would say, because the technology came after his time. We're used to by now talking to each other in this digital space on Zoom. There's amazing things and mysteries and places to be in awe of that. How is it possible that the world works in such a way that we can each open these devices in different places and be able to connect to each other the way that we can? And there's a way in which we're used to explaining it, or we know there's someone who can explain it. I can't explain to you exactly how it happens, but we know somewhere the tech people know how to explain how it happens. And Heschel says our explanations for things lead us to think we understand how it works and make us immune to the mysteries of the world. And the refocus, Cheryl, that you were talking about, how do we get to looking at every leaf, every sunset, every face of every person that we encounter? How do we build our own sacred relationships, sacred times, sacred spaces, in both the big collective ways and in the small, simple ways, and realize that that's also a noticing of God's immanent presence in the world. That could give us sacredness, and in some ways, I think some of the reason why these things don't work out, right? Revelation, redemption, sacred space, and the Torah don't work out is because the Israelites are so focused on their own needs and their own ego and their own day-to-day realities and what's not right about it, that they too miss out on some of the ways that they could have connected with God. And the Israelites model some of the challenge that we have in this day as well. But I think you're right. There are lots of places we can look for God's presence, and not just in sanctuaries and tabernacles, but in the simple things we encounter all the time. Susie.
Thank you. The irony in all of this to me is that in our prayers, we are constantly saying we are waiting for God. And in reality, I think God is waiting for us.
You also might be exempt from reading Heschel, right? If you go to the title of Heschel's book, God in Search of Man, right, that's a philosophy of Judaism. And Heschel's claim is, well, Heschel says that Judaism's claim is God desperately wants to be our partner. And God is calling out to us, and we fail to hear the call. Both at right the the Bible's claim, he says, is that God is trying to reach us. Right, Revelation in the Bible is meant to suggest us the possibility that we can hear God's voice, and we should seek it in our own day. And Susie, Heschel would agree with you that there's much about how we approach things that causes us not to listen, and that we might be better off if we start listening. And that's a powerful idea that he writes about in God to Search a Man. So thank you for that. But Jay.
So I'm wondering, thinking that God's presence in a space, be it a sacred space or just in nature or anywhere, is part of it, but we have to be able to act in a sacred way to work with God to really make its space sacred. So it's kind of a combination, God, and we should be carrying out what God would want, how God would want us to act.
Yeah, that's the partnership. That's the covenant. That's the other idea that Heschel calls out with this. Once we hear God's voice, if we're able to hear God's voice, we get to that place, it calls us to action. It calls us to act. The ideas embedded in the Torah that are the echoes of God's voice, says Heschel, about compassion for others, about living a life filled with sacredness, about stepping beyond ourselves and attaching ourselves to a cause that's better for the whole, are things that we feel commanded to do in response to God's voice, in response to what we intuit about the world from when we hear God. And you're right? Feeling God's presence is not the end. Feeling God's presence is the beginning of action. It's the call to action. It's what inspires us to move. So the goal isn't to like go into the sanctuary and be there and leave wowed. The goal is to go into the tabernacle or go into your own, the literal one or the simple one that you find in your own space, and to hear the call and then to do something about it. And, that's why Heschel's famous for getting up out of the seminary and going to march with Martin Luther King. And when people said, why are you missing your classes to do this? You're supposed to be teaching our rabbinic students. He said, how can I sit and study Torah when God is calling me to right this wrong in the world? And he was, a model for living that about, I must do this because I know this is what God is demanding of me, and I'm going to go do it. And Jay, you're so right about that. I see a few more hands, and we still have a few more minutes.
Yeah, we'll go to Heidi and then Eileen, and then we can wrap up.
Okay, great.
Hi, I just felt like as I'm listening to everyone, we've created sacred space here among us. And I felt like listening to the wisdom of everyone who had input, even if people say similar things, it's unique to them, which made me feel like saying out loud that sacred space is among us as we interact with each other and share our feelings and thoughts. That's all.
I love that. I wonder if, sacred space, first of all, space we define in lots of ways. It's the era in which we're in is challenging us to think about, is this Zoom gathering a space? I know as I clicked onto it, the link in the invite I had was in the location, right? What's the location of this event? It was the Zoom link. It's funny, when I clicked on it, Google took me to Google Maps and told me couldn't find this space. So I had to, I copied the link and I went through my browser. But I wonder, in what way is space redefining itself, and how is this a space that could also be a sacred space, right? We brought ourselves and Torah into this space, and the goal and part of Torah study is to bring the echo of God's voice into the room. And Heidi, as you said, maybe we did that. At the same time, I also think about, Heschel, in a different book, his book about Shabbat, talks about a unique piece of Judaism, which is about creating sacred time, right? Where lots of religions only have sacred space. We think about sacred time on a regular, not just for the big holidays, but on a weekly basis with our approach to Shabbat. And so do the religions that came out of Judaism that have a Sabbath, as well. I wonder if there's different poles of holiness, right? Sacred space, sacred time, sacred community, and it might be that different ones overlap. And so I'm going to chew on this idea that, this is digital space and how this is a space, but I also feel that there's a digital, there's a communal covenant that we've created with each other here in this space, and we can find that holiness in each other as well. So it could be the people, it could be the space, it could be the time. I say that not to debate your position, Heidi, but to like expand on it, that there are lots of ways we're bringing holiness into the room. All right, Eileen.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Heidi and Jay, and what I was thinking is God is within. And no matter where you go with God. And I think and correct me, Rabbi, please, that we were created in the image of God. So we try to, best be God-like, which is very, very difficult.
It does have its challenges. Theology sometimes is divided into two realms. There are two categories. One is a theology that has a transcendent God. God is above and beyond and all powerful and distant and watching over, right, and removed, so that who are we, grains of sand, compared to God, right, the Almighty, the all powerful, the everlasting. That's one vision. What we've talked about today, and Heschel is definitely in that camp, is that God is immanent, meaning God is present. God is here. What you said, Eileen, is one manifestation is that right, God is within all of us, and we are reflections of the image of God. God is so immanent, so ever present, so right, reachable, that's even part of the fabric of us. Right, and some of the power of Heschel's theology is an expansion of that. The note, right? It in some ways, right? You might have learned this in nursery school or kindergarten, right? God, I'm going to sing around. God is here. God is there. Something. God is everywhere. In my head, I knew the tune before I started singing. There's a cuter. Ask your grandchildren if you have them, or your children if you have them, if they're the right age to sing that better than I just did. But some of that song is a reflection of like that God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. That's a great articulation of the immanent theology and Heschel's theology, that we can find God's presence everywhere. We just have to be open to notice it. And so much of what we build, what we create, what we do gets in the way. And I'll say one last thing because I know we're almost out of minutes. In some ways, for Heschel, that's a division between the weekday and Shabbat, which is coming in a few moments for those of you who are from Europe, and a little later for depending on what time zone you're in. But the notion is we do have to do practical things, right? If I didn't cook Shabbat dinner, if I didn't go to work, I don't have money for food. If I don't cook dinner, I don't have stuff to eat. But right on Shabbat, where we take time off of that practical labor to try to notice the world, Shabbat can be a confluence of where we set aside the day to day to be able to open our souls to notice what we might be distracted from about the world, which is God's presence. And that's why for Heschel, Shabbat is a palace in time. So I hope that this week, as we read from the Torah about the palace in space that we build to help find God's presence, as we usher in Shabbat, which is a palace in time where we try to find God's presence, that we together sat with each other trying to find God's presence. I hope you get a little taste of some of those over the Shabbat that's coming. I really appreciate all the lots of great comments from lots of people, and I know for me, lots of new voices, and which is good because with so many people on the call, everyone doesn't get to talk every week. So I'm glad we got to hear from so many people today. And that's what I got. I'm going to turn it back over to our capable moderator, who's going to take us home.
Not much else. Just wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. We will miss you next week, but hope you can celebrate Purim with us. And we will see you hopefully on March 21st for our next Torah study. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.